Great. Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable to you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Happy Pride Sunday. This Sunday, we're going to explore St. Matthew's message, wherein Jesus says to his followers, whoever welcomes you welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. We'll look at this in the context of the struggles for equality by LGBTQ folks, by persons of color, and by women in our country. But first, a personal note. When I was 3 or so, one of my uncles pulled my dad aside to proffer some well-intentioned parenting advice. He warned that if my dad wasn't careful, I'd turn out as queer as a $3 bill. Well, I have two thoughts on that. First, he was never one of my favorite uncles. And second, how prescient of him in 1957. So despite Dad's best efforts, I never embraced sports. I hated snakes because they made me scream, and I had to rely on my little sister Roberta to deal with the bullies who tormented me from time to time. Later, as a socially awkward teenager, I was too steeped in being the caretaker for my 3 sibs and trying to be the perfect son to spend any time worrying about romantic crushes. I did manage the obligatory junior prom and senior ball experiences with young women, both of whom are Facebook friends today, but there was no dating, no awareness, no romance. When I finally escaped to the University of the Pacific in the fall of '72, I did add a girlfriend to the mix. After we parted ways, I found another girlfriend that my family just adored. She was wicked smart, she had a wicked, very quick wit, and she was utterly charming. And like her predecessor, she was left wondering just why I was hanging on to my V card so tightly. Pause. If you need to translate it, look it up on one of those dictionaries. When I finally made it to the health center to talk through some stuff with a psychologist my sophomore year, I was met by a smug little man who identified the root of all my problems as being homosexuality. And he told me that being a homosexual was just like smoking. It was merely a bad habit that could be kicked if I really wanted it badly enough. Now, mind you, I was 20 years old when I heard that from a psychologist. So one of the advantages of being an introvert with a highly honed set of analytical skills was that after wallowing and ruminating for a month or so, I rejected his hypothesis and I reported him to the executive director of the health center. And then I set out on my journey to self-discovery. Now we're going to fast forward past the awkwardness, the awkward but somewhat sweet romantic entanglement of the last half of my college years. But I want to tell you about my first coming out story. And that came about because I burst into tears at the end of the book, The Front Runner, a gay classic. And it was in front of my sister Roberta, who was also my college roommate. Then I blurted out, "I'm gay." And so then she made blueberry muffins to celebrate for us the next morning. And if anything, that was just a hugely welcoming and assuring gesture, to be sure, and certainly worthy of a gold star from St. Matthew in following his teachings. Now, my second coming out experience came about after graduation. When I got my first big job in San Francisco, my dear aunts Connie and Lou, yes, the same Auntie Lou that you all know, they invited me to live with them. I commuted from San Leandro to the city on BART and enjoyed daily laundry service, great cocktail hours with scintillating conversation, and wonderful meals. After throwing myself into the job and socking money away for 6 months, I was ready to move into a place of my own in San Francisco. So on the Friday morning of moving weekend, I came home from work only to discover that my ever helpful Aunt Connie, my incredibly organized Aunt Connie, had decided that she would help me get a head start on packing. Specifically, she had carefully boxed up my clothes and the contents of my bureau and neatly labeled every box. My sweaters, my underwear, my collection of gay fiction, my magazines, they were all alphabetized and in date order. I was mortified and a little afraid, but secretly relieved and very thankful. So I walked into the kitchen, I gave her a big hug, told her thank you for helping me with the packing, and I asked for an old-fashioned. Now, nothing was said, but a month later, when I came over for dinner one night, Auntie Connie was offering cocktail options, and she slyly said, "I suppose you're off drinks with orange juice these days," as a nod to the citrus industry boycott over their homophobic spokesmodel, Anita Bryant. So, not a cup of water, but an old-fashioned, and a gold star for my Auntie Connie, who has ascended to glory from St. Matthew. Now, my third and final coming out story that I'm going to share with you this morning took place about a year later. After experiencing the exhilaration of my very first Pride Parade in 1977, and upon learning that there were other gay men working in our corporate headquarters, I befriended a small group for daily coffee breaks. Armistead Maupin was presenting his book, Tales of the City, in serial form in the San Francisco Chronicle, which we would read in a quiet corner of McKesson's break room every day. When one of the protagonists wrote home, coming out in his letter to Mama, a few of us followed suit. The letter to my parents took 2 days to reach Concord, California. The phone rang at work. My dad demanded that they meet me at my apartment that evening. And through tears and confusion and disappointment, it was expressed that despite my best efforts to be the perfect son, taking care of their younger children without complaint and exceeding every expectation set before me, that I was sick. Further, that I would have 1 year to get better. And they'd even pay for the shrink. And that we would then check in at the end of the year to determine where I stood with all that. Not quite what I had hoped, but I figured they'll come around. So a year later, my dad wrote me and begged me to carefully consider the response that I was to send him. At the time, he followed a very fundy, very conservative radio evangelist whose Levitical misinterpretations informed my dad's worldview. And he just knew in his heart that I was going to hell. And he didn't want my sinfulness to infect his other children. At that point, I had to acknowledge that I was still a big old mo, and that I still didn't think that there was anything wrong with that. And that I was nevertheless very, very sorry that I had disappointed him. His response in turn was to disown me, to forbid me from contacting my sibs or my mom, and to not allow my name to be mentioned under his roof. His reign of silence lasted on and off for 4 decades. Ultimately, in the final years of his life, before dementia took the last of his memories, and when I was one of his primary caretakers, he asked for my forgiveness. And I gave him my cup of welcome, which was never withdrawn from him during those 40 years. And we were able to reconcile. So why are we talking about Pride celebrations? And really, what was the point of my overly long chronicle of my life events? Well, here's a timeline for everybody. In January 1965, 4 years before Stonewall, a costume ball was held in San Francisco to benefit organizations that facilitated dialogue between clergy and gay people. This is 1965. The San Francisco Police Department raided the hall, interfered with the gathering, and harassed the partygoers, effectively driving away hundreds of expected attendees. Arrests were made of the organizers, and a court trial was held. The jury returned a verdict of not guilty, and the police department was forced to appoint a liaison to the gay community. Now, 4 years later was Stonewall in New York, that infamous incident that fueled a much more visible response nationally to attempts to stifle and or eradicate rights of gay and lesbian persons. 4 years after that, in 1973, the American Psychiatric Association removed homosexuality from their list of mental disorders. Now, you remember my college visit to the center? That was 1973. Now, I later learned that just like the mental disorder designation, that staff therapist was removed too, which gave me no small amount of joy. So now let's bring this home to our church. In 1976, the General Convention of the Episcopal Church declared that homosexual persons are children of God, who have a full and equal claim with all other persons upon the love, acceptance, and pastoral concern and care of the church. In 2003, Gene Robinson, an openly gay priest, was consecrated a bishop of the church. In 2009, General Convention resolved that God's call to ordained ministry is indeed open to all. In 2012, a provisional rite of blessing for same-gender relationships was authorized, and discrimination against trans persons in the ordination process was prohibited. And in 2015, the canons of the church were finally changed to make the rite of marriage available to all people, regardless of gender. And yet today, lawsuits persist over property caught up in the schism exacerbated by Bishop Robinson's consecration. Hate crimes based on sexual identity or expression continue to plague the news cycles. And there are so many places in the US where LGBTQ persons are still not safe. There continue to be televangelists and conservative pastors who spew hate from their pulpits, ignoring Jesus's admonitions to welcome all, to minister to the others in our midst. And on a global level, there are far too many countries where LGBTQ folks continue to be persecuted, jailed, terrorized, and even murdered in the name of the church. So yes, there's been much progress in ensuring equality and dignity and respect toward LGBT persons. And yes, it has all come about in a relatively short period of time, only 50 years. But we still have quite a way to go before all people feel the welcome which Jesus calls us to offer. How much longer will LGBTQ people have to wait before they are fully welcomed to the table? And if 50 years sounds like a long time to be battling for basic human rights, how about 170? Discussions about women's rights began around 1848 in New York under the organization of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, two of the honored saints of the Episcopal Church. The Seneca Fall Convention produced a declaration of sentiments that stated, somewhat familiarly, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. There was more organizing throughout the 1850s, but then the Civil War caused the women's rights movement to lose momentum. Think about that, 1850. After the war, the 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, extended the protections of the Constitution to all citizens. But of course, they defined all citizens as being male. Then the 15th Amendment in 1870 guaranteed the right to vote for all male citizens. Although some of the Western states began to extend the vote to women in 1910, it really wasn't until August of 20 that the 19th Amendment allowed women to vote in elections across the US. 3 years later, the National Women's Party proposed a constitutional amendment that prohibited all discrimination on the basis of sex. And yet, the Equal Rights Amendment, since it was first proposed in 1923, has never been ratified. So 100 years later, 100 years have now passed since the 19th Amendment was put into law. Yet we are still far from equal representation in the leadership of legislative bodies and at the helm of commerce by women. What are the obstacles to welcoming full participation by women in city councils, state houses, legislatures, courts, and companies? Who keeps blocking those refreshing and life-sustaining cups of water to which all women are due? Now, I'm going to give you a third set of timelines as you're all checking your watches. And this one touches on some of the history behind our racial justice conversations that we've been having since the beginning of June. Slavery had flourished for almost 300 years in the territory that currently comprises our current United States, before President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. The fledgling steps toward political freedom for African Americans began with the 13th Amendment in 1865, which officially abolished slavery. In 1868, as we discussed before, the 14th Amendment granted citizenship rights to former slaves who were male. And the 15th in 1870 granted those male former slaves voting rights. Now, those three amendments, of course, were undermined starting 10 years later with the passage of Jim Crow laws. And the repeal of those laws took 7 decades. Now, although FDR ended discrimination in the defense industry in 1941, convenient for the Second World War, it really wasn't until after July 48 that all racial segregation was abolished in our own US military. In 1954, the Supreme Court ruled in Brown versus Board of Education that racial segregation in public schools violated the 14th Amendment. The following year, the court ordered local jurisdictions to take appropriate steps to integrate public school with all deliberate speed. Now, in southern states, that all deliberate speed took 15 years to enact. So we have other major events, as our history books have taught us. Rosa Parks sparking the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955 and 56. The Greensboro Four in North Carolina, showing the way of nonviolent resistance to achieve integrated public lunch counters. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. leading a peaceful interracial assembly of 200,000 people at the Lincoln Memorial. And it was here in 1963 that people first heard the inspiring "I Have a Dream" speech. The Civil Rights Act was signed into law by President Johnson after Congress balked when it was first presented by JFK. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 aimed to ensure that African Americans could exercise their right to vote under the 15th Amendment, which had passed 95 years before. Now, really? So I ask again, who or what is withholding the welcome, the acceptance, the acknowledgement of the dignity and rights of every human being? 450 years of oppression, enslavement, endangerment, and race-based violence precede today's expressions of Black Lives Matter. 200 years of treatment as chattel or somehow less than, and women are still not consistently allowed at the tables of power and are still subject to gender-based violence. 50 years of humiliation, harassment, and physical peril precede today's battles that threaten to reverse guarantees of basic human rights for LGBTQ persons. So the question is, how might we witness? What can we do to change the hearts of those fear-laden power mongers who believe that their only path to security involves stripping everything from those who are different? Jesus said, "Whoever welcomes you welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me." How do we get this memo into the hands of those who stand in the way of God's kingdom today?